Today we're going to look at causes of the American Revolution. These are Unit 1, Notes number 3. The role of the colonies. The main purpose of the colonial system was to enrich the mother country of Britain. Britain looked to its American colonies as a market for British goods, a source of raw materials that were not native to Britain, and as a producer of goods and materials to be sold to other nations. However, the American colonists began to export their goods to other countries like Spain, France, and Holland. So the American colonists were trying to make their own money. Britain viewed the colonists' pursuit of foreign markets as an economic threat because the money wasn't coming directly to them. And they felt that all of the resources, all of the goods within the colonies belonged to them. As a result, Britain passed the Navigation Acts, a series of laws restricting colonial trade. This system would benefit Britain and prove to be good for the colonists as well. However, not all of them saw it this way. So the Navigation Acts, what did they do? So no country could trade with the colonies unless the goods were shipped in either colonial or English ships. So this portion helped to benefit the colonies because it increased shipbuilding, so it created revenue and boosted the economy. All vessels had to be operated by crews that were at least 3/4 English or colonial. The colonies could export certain products only to England, and almost all goods traded between the colonies and Europe first had to pass through an English port. So tensions emerge. A number of colonial merchants resented these trade restrictions. Many continued to either smuggle in goods or to trade illegally with other countries. The leaders and merchants of Massachusetts were some of the top offenders. Britain revoked their corporate charter, and Massachusetts became a royal colony under strict control of the crown. Seeds of self-government. Every colony had a governor appointed by the king who served as the highest authority. The governor would oversee a political structure that included an advisory council and local assembly elected by eligible colonists. And so here we begin to see these seeds of self-government. The colonies were beginning to develop a taste for self-government, the idea of they are electing their peers into positions of power to create laws for them. They are part of the process. And so as they begin to develop this taste for self-government, it also will help to create conditions for rebellion because they are not going to like Britain overseeing them, creating laws, more taxes on them. They want to make their own rules. Impact from the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War ended in 1763 with Britain claiming all of North America east of the Mississippi River. So the French and Indian War was between France and Great Britain, and they're trying to decide, who's going to control this North American territory. So the French had been there, British had been there, and had too many conflicts. So they finally had a war. Britain came out on top. By this time, tensions between Britain and Massachusetts had been increasing. British custom officials began to search colonial homes because many of the merchants who were smuggling or still trading illegally, they operated their businesses out of their homes. And so British officials could just have these search warrants written and could go into any home that they wanted without any probable cause. And so they felt like their rights were being violated. They did not like this type of treatment. The British government stationed 10,000 troops in the territories, and the colonists worried that the standing army might turn against them. They didn't like this idea of having an army watching them. Britain had also borrowed so much money during the war that it nearly doubled its national debt. So they are wanting to pay it off. They're trying to find ways to make more money. And so usually when a country needs money, one of the easiest solutions is to add more taxes to its citizens to pay back whatever the debt is. In this case, Britain chose to enact more taxes over the colonists. So they felt they were being treated unfairly, and they were unfairly taxed more than actual British citizens. In 1764, the English Parliament issued the Sugar Act in an effort to combat their debt. Among other things, it made smuggling a more severe crime. By the end of 1764, the colonists and Britain were disagreeing on more and more about how they should be taxed and governed. So you really start to see this divide beginning with the colonists and Britain. So let's stop and think. How did the French and Indian War change the American colonies? So if we look at this map from 1754 to 1763, right after the French and Indian War, one of the biggest changes is the land that was controlled. So the British territory is in lavender, and the French territory is in this gold color. So from one map to another, we see that the French territory has been wiped out. So the British kind of took over, Spanish kind of took over the rest. So that's one of the biggest changes. And so this will actually cause a lot of problems because as the British territory is now expanding past the Appalachian Mountains, the colonists are going to have more conflicts with Native Americans. Just because they had more land didn't necessarily give them less problems. And then another big impact is the cost of the war and the fact that Britain is enacting all of these taxes. So we're also going to see that effect kind of snowball out of control. The colonies organized to resist. In order to finance debts from the French and Indian War, Parliament had turned its attention to the resources of the colonies. The Stamp Act was passed in March of 1765. It required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for every legal document, license, newspaper, pamphlet, and almanac. The Sons of Italy began harassing custom workers and stamp agents. They were this, resistance group. They were kind of leading the charge, and the colonies should be independent. And so, as they began to harass these workers, many stamp agents across the colonies just resigned. They didn't feel the job was worth all of the harassment. Individual colonial assemblies began to pass resolutions that they could only be taxed by their own representatives. Colonial assemblies also passed the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which stated that Parliament lacked the power to impose taxes on the colonies because they were not represented. So kind of pushing forward this idea that there's no taxation without representation. That was one of their biggest grievances, that in Parliament they're creating these taxes, but no one is there in the British Parliament representing the colonists, their interests, or speaking up on their behalf. The Boston Massacre. So the presence of British soldiers in Boston streets charged the air with hostility. The Bostonian people did not like this. The city soon erupted in clashes between British soldiers and colonists. One such attack was labeled the Boston Massacre, and this little illustration below is meant to depict that. And so the phrase, the Boston Massacre, was coined by Samuel Adams, part of the Sons of Liberty. And again, being part of the Sons of Liberty, he is part of this resistance group, does not like colonial rule, so he's trying to create this narrative of what's happening. And so by calling it the Boston Massacre, even though only I think it was 3 people died, it's beginning to present this event as a British attack against defenseless citizens. So the Boston Tea Party. Colonists protested a new tea act that would cut colonial tea merchants out of the tea trade. It was this weird tax that basically made it cheaper for them to buy foreign tea than American tea. So they were very, very upset about it. In late 1773, a large group of Boston rebels disguised themselves as Native Americans and took action against 3 British ships. They dumped 18,000 pounds of tea into the Boston Harbor, and this became known as the Boston Tea Party. So it's just an act of defiance, of showing how they're not going to follow these laws and acts that they're putting in place. And again, tensions are increasing. The colonists are becoming more and more upset with what's going on. So let's stop and think. what did the colonists have to be upset about? And so we have this little timeline at the bottom, seeing kind of like examples of the different acts that are happening and the Boston Massacre. We see the colonists being upset because they feel like they're being unfairly treated with these new acts that are happening, the fact that soldiers are being placed in their cities, the fact that officials can just come into their homes and search. And so it creates a lot of tensions. You're going to see events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party happen because it's a reaction to all of these events that they see as unfair. The fighting begins. The First Continental Congress met in September of 1774 in Philadelphia to create a Declaration of Colonial Rights. The Continental Congress asked for representatives from every colony, and so they all met in Philadelphia to discuss these issues. They defended the colony's right to run their own affairs. They also agreed to meet again in 1775 if their demands were not met. After this meeting, many eastern towns began to step up military preparations just in case things escalate even further. The Minutemen were civilian soldiers, and so they began to gather up weapons and ammunitions. The British General Gage heard rumors of Minutemen prepping and gathering large amounts of weapons. Gage intended to march his troops to Concord by way of Lexington and seize the leaders of the resistance and destroy all hidden weapons. The leaders of the resistance were tipped off to the arrival of the British and were able to prepare ahead of time. The Battle of Lexington was the first conflict between the British and the colonists. With the element of surprise on their side, the colonists were able to do damage to the British Army. And so in the illustration off to the side, you can see the British with their red coats, and then the Minutemen, which again are just civilian soldiers, so they are in their own clothes, they don't have uniforms, and just showing this kind of resistance militia of the colonies kind of joining together and gathering. The colonies hover between peace and war. In May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress met to discuss their next move. Conflicts between British soldiers and Minutemen were still happening. John Adams proposes that each colony set up their own government and for Congress to declare them independent. He also wanted the Minutemen to be recognized as the Continental Army. George Washington would be put in charge of the Continental Army. By early summer 1776, Congress appointed a committee to prepare a formal declaration explaining the reasons for the colonies wanting independence. Thomas Jefferson would be chosen as the head writer. The Declaration of Independence drew on concepts from Enlightenment thinker John Locke, specifically his ideas on natural rights. The American colonies used this document to declare their independence from Britain and list ways the British king had violated their unalienable rights of the Americans. They also, in this document, declare that all men are created equal. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted by Congress. So today, one of your assignments will be to read over the Declaration and take part in a discussion about it. Patriot and Loyalist. Americans now face the bitter choice, revolution or loyalty to the crown. Those who were supporters of independence became known as patriots. Patriots drew their numbers from people who saw economic opportunity in an independent America. Quakers supported the Patriots but did not fight because they did not believe in war. So Patriots also saw that the colonies could do a better job governing themselves and not having to be imposed acts and laws and taxes by a foreign ruler. Loyalists. These were Americans who opposed independence and remained loyal to the crown. Many Loyalist sympathizers changed sides as the war progressed. Some Loyalists felt a special tie to the king and supported him because they thought the British would win and didn't want to be punished as rebels. Many Native Americans supported the British because they viewed the colonial settlers as a bigger threat. So we are done with our notes. We will talk about the Declaration of Independence today. later on in our Zoom.